Here we go. Welcome everyone to Basecamp. We're joined today by Angela Duckworth. Angela is a psychologist, best-selling author, professor, researcher. She's the founder and CEO of the Character Lab, whose charter is to advance scientific insights to help children thrive. Just an amazing, brilliant mind, and someone that has a big mission and does great work to advance not only thriving in children, but also in the rest of us. So I'm so honored to welcome you today, Angela, to Basecamp. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm excited for this conversation.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, this is a bit of a full circle moment for me. Angela may or may not remember me, but probably not. 10 years ago, I was leaving the military, transitioning out of the SEAL teams, and went to get my MBA at University of Pennsylvania. And I was already the old guy in the back of the business school class, but I was the really old guy in the back of Angela's undergraduate class, which was an introduction to positive psychology that she was gracious enough to let me audit. And it was really that class that connected a lot of dots for me from my time in the military and what I saw SEALs lean into to perform at high levels, to the emerging research and ongoing research in the field of positive psychology and what it really takes to help set people up to thrive, that put me on this path that ultimately resulted in Madefor. So Angela, thank you so much for letting me audit your class 10 years ago. And yeah, again, thanks for being here today.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. And I do remember, so yeah, like you and I have both been on, I think, similar paths actually in the intervening decades. So very happy to be talking trading notes.
Amazing, amazing. Well, maybe I know you might be most familiar to listeners with from your best-selling book Grit and the research and the that you put into that and help people understand as grit as the determining factor for success in excess of IQ or in excess of a lot of other factors that we might traditionally think of being what allows people to succeed. But maybe before we talk about grit, and I do want to cover that, how did you get to a place where you started researching grit, and what was the role that positive psychology played in that path for you?
I'm happy to share some of my story. So my mom and my dad immigrated to the United States from China. And I had, in particular with my dad, this like ongoing conversation about excellence. I mean, my dad was just obsessed with achievement, his own, his children's. Historically, who were the greatest generals, physicists, and, you know, painters, CEOs of DuPont. I mean, like, he just thought about it all the time. And when he talked to me about who he most admired, he would often kind of intimate or sometimes say explicitly that the truly greatest achievers were brilliant. I mean, they were gifted. They had a genius that was, you know, more or less the explanation for, you know, why they were so extraordinary. And that, I think, instilled in me, I had a little rebellious streak, I have to say, a kind of like, well, that can't be the whole story. But also probably as a defense mechanism, like, I knew I was not stupid, but I also knew that I was no genius. So I, you know, wondered, you know, what else is there to success, and what else is there that might be there for me, you know, as a daughter who wanted her father's attention and love and approval as well. So fast forward to what I am today, which is a psychologist who's really trying to reverse engineer human thriving, you know, human excellence. You know, I, like my dad, love Olympic gold medalist athletes and Nobel laureates and 3-star Michelin chefs. I will never tire of witnessing and marveling at human excellence at its highest level. And it can be for even, I think, the unsung heroes, but there are, you know, excellent bus drivers, and there are excellent 4th grade teachers. You know, I think human beings can do many things. And I think anything that a human can do, they can do excellently. So I am somebody who was trained by Marty Seligman. He was my PhD advisor, a name that will be familiar to many, but maybe not all. So I'll just say, for those of you who've never heard of Marty Seligman is well known for the study of happiness and for christening this whole field of positive psychology, which is the study of the good life, but primarily happiness. And I think where I have learned from Marty is like how to study experience and life above the 0 point. So not studying necessarily pathology and the like, but more studying the right side of the distribution. But where we differ is I think Marty has primarily been interested in a life of happiness. And I am personally interested in that, but I, as a scientist, am more a specialist in the study of motivation, of voluntary effort, and of achievement.
Interesting. And it seems that when you break down you break grit down in components of passion and perseverance. And on the surface, you think about grit, that doesn't seem like something that one would engage in to live a happy life or a more meaningful life. But the two worlds kind of meet, the world of positive psychology and maybe the work that Marty does into having a life well lived and a meaningful, purposeful life, and grit, which is this combination of passion and perseverance. They seem to meet up at some point.
So 2 nights ago, I was at Marty's for dinner. I've now known him so long. It was like not long after Father's Day. And on Father's Day, I sent him emails like, Marty, you're my second father. So happy Father's Day. I wouldn't be the psychologist I am. I wouldn't be the person I am. I certainly wouldn't be where I am without you. So then a couple nights later, which is, I think it was Tuesday night, I was over for dinner and we were talking actually, and this will get to this question of like, can you be gritty and happy at the same time? I think the answer is yes. In fact, I think it's clear from the data that statistically it's much more likely that happiness and grit will go together in a person versus, one, kind of like is gritty at the expense of happy. And it's the same goes the other way, like that you'd be like, anyway, they don't go against each other, they go together. But here's the dinner conversation that brought this up. I said, Marty, do you remember when I was a graduate student? And one of the things that we were puzzled over is why human unhappiness is increasing at the same time that the objective conditions of human civilization are getting better over the sweep of decades and centuries, right? So some may be familiar with this research that, I know locally and in 2022, there's a lot to be unhappy about. But if you think about the last 500 or 1,000 or more years of human civilization, it's just a much more stable, peaceful, equitable, wonderful standard of living that we all enjoy. You're unlikely to like walk down the street and get murdered, if you look at historically, civilization has made progress. But over the last century, data suggests that people are less happy, more anxious, more depressed, less satisfied over the sweep again of decades. So I remember thinking about this with Marty when I was in graduate school. And so we returned to that topic 2 nights ago. And Marty said, well, what I think is that we have all this leisure time that we didn't have because of, the forces of industrialization and, the things that have brought us, clean water and air conditioning and the like. And he's like, I don't think people are happy when they don't have something to do. And I said, Marty, there's a paper I'm writing called The Good Life. And I reveal in that paper what I think makes people happy. I think at our core, each and every one of us, whether we would describe ourselves as ambitious or not, each of us is, because of our DNA, goal-driven. Like every one of us, like a goal is a desired future state. And sometimes you can think of people having goals like, a 10-year goal or a 5-year goal or a lifelong goal. But even the goal to like make yourself lunch, like the goal to like remember to call your mother-in-law. I mean, these are desired future states. Like they're things that are in the future that haven't yet come about. And I think the thing that brings us all together is that what grit is having long-term goals that you're willing to work very hard toward and that are identity relevant. They're like so important to you that they're almost like who you are. And therefore there's this passion piece. And it's not an accident, I think, that happiness and grit are correlated, because I think when I am at my happiest is that when I am pursuing a desired future state and it's going pretty well. And when I am at my least happy, it's one of two things. Either it's not going so well, or I don't have a goal at all. And I think people who lack goals are profoundly distressed. And so just to bring the whole picture together, Marty and I wonder whether the kind of necessities, the exigencies of human existence, which, we don't want to romanticize, but like people got up in the morning and they had to do things. And if things were going pretty well for the things they had to do to survive, they were pretty happy. So that's how I think happiness and grit go together. And I have longitudinal studies now that show that when you measure happiness and grit over time, repeatedly, you find that there's a virtuous cycle, that happier people at time 1 tend to be grittier at time 2, and grit at time 2 tends to predict being happier at time 3. And if anything, the arrows are stronger for the causal force of happiness. I mean, they're both positive. So yeah, that's a longer answer than I intended, but I think it's something to continue to think about.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating to think how happiness and grit are correlated. And that there may be some causality interaction between the two, but also when you think about, oftentimes we're presented with, hey, this is the ideal state, or this is the ideal life, or the ideal environment you want to place yourself in, but you could put someone in the best environment in the world, or quote unquote, the happiest environment in the world, and that person could in fact be miserable because they don't have something to do. They don't have a goal, some way to add value. And I love this. You had a quote, I believe it was a quote from Bill Damon, or not Bill, it's a quote in your book where you said, mature passions of gritty people depend on both interest and purpose. And it's this purpose of having a higher intention to contribute to the well-being of others where the greatest difference is made. And so the goal is one thing. And if you have a goal and you have something to do, then the more you're connected to that goal or driven by that goal, the grittier you're going to be, the more successful you're going to be in achieving that goal. But at the same time, when that goal is, and correct me where I'm going wrong here, but where that goal is mapped to the well-being of others or to the betterment of a larger whole or larger society, then you're actually going to amplify the effects of that and feel even better, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, I don't want to correct you at all. I just want to amplify maybe what you're saying. So if a goal is a desired future state, which is, the scientific definition of a goal, and we think other animals than human beings have goals, but we don't think they have them quite in the way that humans do. The complexity of our goals, like we have hierarchies of goals, goals that are more important to us, goals that are in service of other goals. It's not clear that lower order animals have all those things. So there's lots to say about goals. And I think, or not, I just want to say, like, I'm not the only psychologist who thinks that, like, at our core, human beings are, goal directed, but there are different kinds of goals, right? So let's make one distinction between, goals that are primarily or entirely personal and, when we achieve them, we're better off. And then there are goals where when we achieve them, someone else is better off. So you can call these altruistic goals or pro-social goals. But because I like alliteration, obviously, let's call them personal versus pro-social goals. You're absolutely right, I think, Pat, when you like, if life were a multiple choice and you could only choose to fulfill your personal goals or your pro-social goals, which would make you happier, right? And it's a really good question, because it's like, well, maybe the obvious choice is personal goals, because that's what personal goals are. They advance your own interests. But then again, a little voice in you says, I don't know, maybe those pro-social goals, like maybe that, because when you think about your own life probably, and you think about the times where you were just the happiest, it was very often because you were doing something in service of someone else. And I think this language that many people use spontaneously to describe work when it is imbued with pro-social purpose is they will say, I have a calling, right? And having a calling is originally a religious expression. I don't think people mean that when they say it, spontaneously describe their work, but a calling is to be called to serve. Called to serve something larger than yourself and called to serve people. And the data suggests that people in general tend to be happier when pursuing pro-social goals than personal goals. And then again, to bring it back to, happiness research in general, one of the hallmarks of, severe unhappiness, depression, anxiety, is that your field of view is completely taken up with yourself. I mean, the catch-22 or the paradox of, I think, suffering from some of these extremes of unhappiness or insecurity and anxiety is that the only thing you can think of is yourself. And as many philosophers have pointed out, that will never get you to happiness.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. We had Lisa Feldman-Barrett on a few months ago, and Lisa was talking about one of the things that Lisa raised, and is central to her work, is this idea of being in metabolic deficit, and that if you don't have, if your body budget is not balanced and you're in metabolic deficit, that your capacity to engage novelty gets diminished, gets reduced. And so you have a limited ability to update your internal model of the world, to engage with others. And she likes to say that, humans are designed to effectively regulate one another's nervous systems. It's not something that we can do in isolation. And so you talking about, your world gets smaller, and Lisa says, your model gets more rigid and you can't actually engage with one another, and you can't have these bigger goals when in fact those bigger goals, or those more altruistic ways of being, are in fact the very fuel that helps you keep going and buffer you against the shocks or the setbacks. It's fascinating. And even Scott Barry Kaufman, I think last month was on with us, and he was talking about transcendence, and that's the ultimate state that we're all working towards. And when you arrive at that state, it's because some of the foundational basic needs have been met, but it allows you to exist in a state of being. And in state of being, you recognize that myself and the other, there's the walls between us drop, and that allows you to have bigger missions and bigger goals. So it's fascinating when we start to see these points of connection across different areas of research, and they all kind of point in the same general direction. So amazing.
Yeah, I have a lot of respect for both Lisa and Scott, and they're fantastic psychologists. And, if there are ideas that have a time, connection has got to be one of them. Obviously, we've always been Homo sapiens, but I think our visceral, instinctive, and necessary need to connect to each other, I mean, it's only been illuminated by the pandemic, right? And I have data on teenagers, for example, and it's kind of a terrible natural experiment, but in a school district, in a very large and diverse school district in the United States, some of the families were remotely schooling their teenagers, and some of the families had kids completely in school. So, and this is not a public health statement, this is just an observation psychologically, that we then had the opportunity, because we had pre-pandemic data, to see what's the effect of well-being of being socially isolated from everybody outside of your nuclear family. And this is, early pandemic days. And the data were unequivocal on every item, on every scale of social, emotional, and academic well-being. Kids were suffering when they were completely isolated. And I think, again, the pandemic has just highlighted wow, I'm not saying that we're not going to have hybrid work, but people need to connect with other people. We are a social species.
Amazing. Yeah, I think such an important point. You can't underscore that enough. And when you find, this is something we've talked about in the past, but when you find yourself in maybe a time or an environment where you're unable to connect, it's more important at that point to find ways to connect, to do the work, to continue to find ways to connect with others. Even the smallest ways can seem insignificant in the moment, but actually can be incredibly buffering and important to our physical and mental health. So That's
I
awesome.
want to like interject one grit note on this. I have a couple of friends, psychologists, who were like, we should study friendship, right? Because connection's so important. And we were thinking about people who we thought were like outliers in just being like great friends, you know. And there are people where you're like, you are an amazing friend. Like, wow, your relationships with your friends are so deep and so intimate and so long-standing. So we did a little casual research into this, and nothing we think is, publishable yet. But I had to share with you just our hypothesis as psychologists who reflected on friendship. I think there's an overlap with grit in that, friendships are a lot about time on task, right? Like if there is a message in the research on grit that is not entirely obvious, it's that when you do something again and again and again and again and again and again, and every time you do it, you're trying to get a little better. And every time you do it, you get a little feedback on like what went well and what went. Guess what? You become a better chess player, a surfer, a mathematician, a sales manager, a dad. I mean, that's the nature of human skill. But I think it also applies to friendship in a sense. Like a lot of friendship is time on task. And the first time you talk to somebody, it's usually not that fun. And like the second time, and I have found that to be true for myself personally. There are people where I was like, I don't know, like it's fine, but I could also be reading a book right now, or like maybe you want to go off and read a book because that's probably better for you. But after the 20th or 40th or 50th interaction, after we've spent time together and worked on stuff together, it's like you wake up one day and you're like, we're friends. And like it's not something which is like one click shopping, it's not like, I swiped right and like everything is great. So I just want to say that our deep hypothesis, as yet not substantiated by data, is that like physical therapy, like friendship needs repetition and consistency and habit and routine. So I think for me, that was a bit of a revelation because I didn't have that mental model of friendship. I was like, yeah, maybe like, practicing your forehand in tennis, but maybe also for just making friends too.
I'll give you one data point to add to your study. I can say without a doubt in the SEAL teams, you get a bunch of individuals that come together, they go through training together, they go through very challenging circumstances. But when you hear SEALs talk about another SEAL, the marker of success isn't when someone wakes up or whether or not they eat donuts or how many pull-ups they can do or how fast they can run. The marker of whether or not of if you're a good SEAL is if someone says, yes, they're a good team guy. And I say guy because there's only guys right now in the SEAL teams. It's open to everyone, but it's this idea that you are measured by whether or not you're putting the team and the teammates' interest above yourself. And that's something that happens in small ways and happens in big ways. But I think one thing that we have in the teams is this bias for action where you don't ask what people need, you just act. You start to understand, hey, what are the needs of my teammates? And someone's carrying that bag, I'm going to go help them. Someone's doing this, I'm going to go help them. And you just get into this habit and cultivate this almost way of being where you're constantly acting in service of your teammates. And the powerful part about that is that gets reverberated back. And so very quickly you go from a group of individuals to a very cohesive, well-functioning team that is, I would say in many respects unstoppable, that they can handle a lot of challenge and adversity. And that's so one data point there, that it is a habit. It's something you have to work at, but the degree to which you can focus on not asking what people need, but just getting into action and servicing your friendships, your families, whatever, then that often ends up in a good spot. So, N of one.
Yeah, it's good. Good.
I think one of the things that one of the reasons that I was really excited about auditing your class a decade ago was your book Grit. And I think the reason I was so excited about it is I've never been someone that's naturally good at anything, certainly not a genius. So I've had to work really, really hard at everything that I've got. And if people could see how hard I've had to work to do what I've had to do, it's tremendously unimpressive. But one of the things in your book that you talk about is this idea that effort counts twice. So effort counts when you're trying to acquire new skills. Obviously, if you're talented and you have some natural ability, you're going to acquire skills faster, but effort plays a role in that. And then the second following step is that you then have to apply those skills towards whatever it is your overarching goal or the achievements that you're after. And again, effort plays a role in that. And so for me, as someone that relies heavily on effort, I greatly appreciated that. I'm curious if that continues to be your thought or if that's evolved over time.
No, I think I'll say that I'm like holding fast to that belief that, there is kind of two things, right, that determine your skill: the effort you put in, how many hours did you work? Like how hard were you working during those hours, right? And then there's the rate at which you're getting better in those hours, right? So the rate at which you get better is maybe what we mean by talent, right? So yeah, effort and talent have to matter, right? And I'm more talented at psychology, Pat, than I am at, I don't know, lots of things, history, sense of direction, athletic. I mean, just like lots of things. And like when I get better at psychology, it is faster and easier for me relative to other things that I could do. So I think talent matters, and it's a thing. Like it's not, not a thing. But when I say effort counts twice, it's because once you've acquired a skill, you know how to read a psychology paper, you know how to lead a team, you know how to, make a film. I mean, that's a skill. And your skill may be growing, but to convert that skill into something that might help someone else, an achievement, an accomplishment, you have to apply that skill. Okay, now you know how to direct movies, go direct a movie, right? Now you know how to lead teams, like go lead a team. Like now you know how to do a psychology experiment. Well, I guess go run an experiment. So effort is important in terms of translating your skill into actual tangible achievements. And so, I use a little math for those of you who like geek out over like calculus and Newton. It's like got a rough analogy to the laws of mechanics, but that's not necessary just to appreciate, I think, the simple point, which is that effort is different from talent, and that in the sense that it kind of takes that raw potential, enables you to develop skills, and then enables you to take those skills and actually create things in the world. That's the sense in which I mean effort counts twice, and I will stand by that. And I think sometimes talent is so easy to see. I was a math teacher, and I will tell you, you only have to spend one day in the classroom to see differences in talent. There are kids where you're like, it's like this, and they're like, yeah, got it. And the other kids are like, what? And so there are definitely differences in talent, and it's very easy to see. But I think effort in some ways is like hidden or overlooked. I mean, it's quietly there in the background. And what I couldn't see on the first day of teaching was which of my kids was going to really try that year to figure out what was going on in algebra. And I will tell you, at the end of the year, it was not the kids who were like so obviously talented on day one who ended up doing the best. It wasn't, because math is also like physical therapy. There's like a lot of repetition and consistency and hard work and feedback. So I think effort does, in the sense that I was just talking about, as you were talking about, Pat, like I think it counts twice. And I think it's easily overlooked, because any of us have shown up on the softball field or at a workout or in a math class, and it's very obvious to everyone who's talented, but talent and effort are not correlated.
Got it. All right. That gives me hope. That effort counts twice. I like this. I'm curious, and you talk about in your book this idea that grit is not fixed, that we can grow our capacity and grow our ability to become more gritty people. But I'm curious, and I know a focus of your work right now, a lot of your work right now is on children. Does it get, in some respects, you say that as we age, we get grittier because we get more clarity on what those top level goals are. But I also wonder, as we age, we start to get fixated on a specific identity of who we are and what we're capable of and what we can do. How do we think about growing grit as an older person if it's not something that we maybe had historically or something that we were cultivated to have growing up?
Yeah, I will trade you an answer on this question for, I hope, a turn in the conversation at some point, because I would love this community to help me find a CEO for Character Lab. So I'm on the hunt for someone who really loves young people and wants to maybe make a career change and come lead my nonprofit. So I'll trade you an answer on
Done.
how do I develop grit as a grown-up for this other urgent thing that I would be forever grateful for you to help me solve. So I think one of the big discoveries in behavioral science in the last few decades is just how malleable human nature is across the lifespan. So we've always known that babies, are doing a lot of developing and like a lot of like modeling, and that their brains were extremely malleable. And that's why it was so important that we invest in early childhood. That's held up over time, by the way. But then there were discoveries about adolescence. Some scientists consider adolescence to be a second sensitive period for development. There's like lots of plasticity going on in the brain at that time. And if any of us recall being teenagers, those questions of wrestling with your identity and sometimes taking kind of abrupt turns in like the direction that we were heading. But what about the rest of us, right, who are no longer babies, no longer toddlers, and no longer teenagers? So across the lifespan, there's remarkable plasticity. There's not only neuronal growth, which continues throughout the adult lifespan, but also just the kind of remodeling of the synapses and connections. But if you don't, fancy neuroscience is the definitive evidence, and I don't. I think there's also studies of personality and character over long periods of time, and people do change. They become more or less extroverted. They become more or less confident, and your grit is just like all those other characteristics. So then you could ask the question, are there any research studies on whether you can intentionally change your personality and your character? Because just knowing that it changes isn't enough. You want to know that you can voluntarily direct that change. And I think here we have two sources of scientific evidence that say yes. One is research on therapy, because if you think about therapy, one-on-one sessions with a psychologist, that is an intervention, right? And you could ask the question, do people change in any kind of enduring way? Are they still, or are they, have they retained those changes that they maybe make in therapy? And is there any evidence that their personalities change in ways that they want to, maybe 6 months or later after having finished therapy? And the answer is yes. And because therapy is relatively common, there are big studies and lots of data suggest that therapy can change you in ways that you want. And then the second kind of data is that there are these random assignment interventions where people try to change their personality. They want to be more conscientious, they want to be more happy, they want to be more open to experience, they want to be fill in the blank. And the data are very promising that people can actually set goals to change an aspect of their personality and character and make some advances. So last thing I'll say about this is I don't want to paint the picture that you can snap your fingers and become a completely different person overnight. But the theme here is that no matter how old you are, I'm 52, if I really wanted to be, more dependable, more empathic, more patient, more curious, more gritty, I could change any of those things if I wanted to.
Amazing. All right. Well, I think that is going to give people a lot of comfort that you can change. It's certainly something that we believe in, and kind of how we modeled our program at Madefor on. But I think even coming back to what you put out, and if someone wants to change their grit, regardless of their identity coming into in whatever stage of life they're in, it's two components: it's passion and it's perseverance. And it almost seems that passion is what leads first. And if you don't, and something that you've talked about in the past, which I really love, is if you don't know what you're passionate about, play, explore, learn, be open to new experiences, figure out what lights that spark or what resonates for you, and then start pulling at that. And you get into this model of deliberate practice, and the degree to which you're passionate about something or excited or curious, that's going to fuel that deliberate practice. And ultimately, it's going to result in achievement. And you can continue to play that out over and over and over again until you get to where you want to go. So it's just the thought that that play and discovery and openness to new experience has a role here, I think is interesting, and in some ways maybe depressurizes it for people, because if you're 52 or 42 or 62 and you think, man, I've been this way my entire life and I want to be some way else, and grits the path, well, that may sound like a bridge too far for them. But if play is the entry point, then that's
People are
reachable.
never going to be very good at anything that isn't to some extent play for them. And so play is a great way to like think about this. And if you want to see a longer discussion of this, I had to give a commencement speech this graduation for the pandemic classes of my university. So there's a class of 22, but then there were these two classes, the class of 21 and the class of 20, who never got a proper graduation. So I asked myself, like, what should I say in this occasion, you know, this once in a lifetime chance to dispense some amount of wisdom to young people. And I decided to make the whole speech called like, "You Are a Paramecium." And if you want to read it, it's at characterlab.org. But the gist of the speech is that when you look at super achievers, they're specialists, they're experts, and they're kind of voluntarily obsessed with, you know, one thing that they think about 24/7, 52 weeks a year. And that gives you the wrong idea about how to get there, because you think like, oh, I guess I need to like bear down and work on one thing. But when you look at the childhoods, the adolescents, and the early adulthoods of these people, there's a lesson for us all, which is that they do a lot of sampling. I call it "You Are a Paramecium" because a paramecium is a single-celled organism that just bumps around through trial and error, looking for warm water and food. And that's not a terrible way to think about your own journey. Just like keep swimming, and like, I don't know, the water's too cold, like move, you know, like, you know, try a job or like shadow somebody for a day. You don't like it, do something else. But this kind of playful sampling and this willingness to use trial and error to find your way, I think is something which was a discovery for me as a scientist who studied people who were already specialists. I think it was revelatory to me to appreciate that they were not always specialists. You know, butterflies, when they are young, are not little butterflies. They're caterpillars. And so you may be at the stage where, you know, you just try a bunch of things and you look nothing like somebody who's like spending 70 hours a week, like thinking about one thing. So I think that intentional sampling is the play, noticing what you enjoy, you know, noticing when you enter the flow state or something close to the flow state, and noticing what makes your life feel heavy and tiresome to you. Like that's cold water, you know, like swim away from that. I'm very happy not to be a professor of history. Like, thank God. That sounds terrible.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, the next question on my list is, what is the paramecium principle? But you covered it. And so if you're listening, the Character Lab has a website. You can look it up and check it out. Every week they post a new, and I think Angela, it's you, unless you passed off to someone yet, posting a new scientific finding.
Adam Grant, like, you know, people I cajole and convince should turn their scientific insight into 60 seconds of actionable advice. And I will say that we do take a summer break. So like when you go to that website for the summer, it'll just have the last post. But yeah, I definitely invite you there. It's not just me. We're trying to create a medium for the best scientists in the world. And that's obviously not me for like each of these topics, you know, curiosity, humility, generosity, et cetera, to have a place to speak primarily to, you know, people who have young people in their lives. But we also think that the best way a grown-up can do that is to model. So we try to make every tip accessible, you know, at 2 levels. And Pat, if you may, or if you permit, we are actually looking for a new leader because our present and amazing executive director is turning the page on a new chapter in his life. And so if anybody listening thinks, I would love to advance behavioral science to help young people thrive. Like, how cool is that? I would love to work with that person, as I have worked with Sean. And yeah, we are like officially starting our search. So maybe Pat, maybe your Rolodex will have an entrepreneurial, innovative person who wants to apply for this job.
I think we can figure this out. Could you maybe give a primer about the Character Lab, so the work that you do there and what you're focused on, and maybe some studies that you all are working on right now?
Yeah, let me tell you the story of this organization. So maybe 15 years ago, I was just becoming a professor, and I met these two teachers, two educators. One was named Dave Levin, and the other was named Dominic Randolph. And Dave co-founded the KIPP Charter School Network, and Dominic was becoming the headmaster of an elite private school in New York called Riverdale. And they came to me kind of like working with kids at kind of two opposite ends of the socioeconomic spectrum, like the world's most privileged, and then the children had the least advantages. But they actually had the same question, which I thought was interesting. And they said, does science have anything to offer young people? Like, is there something in scientific research that might help people lead a better life? Because as teachers, as educators, like, we keep trying to innovate, but we feel like we're sort of hitting a ceiling on what we can do to, like, help a young person like be happy and successful. So I thought that was a really good question. And we together founded this nonprofit that says, like, there's got to be something at this intersection. And for me, as a former teacher myself, so I taught middle school and high school math for about a half decade in total. And I myself struggled as a teacher. Like, you make jokes with kids, you exhort them, you like bribe them. You're like, how can I get you to learn algebra? Like, come on. Like I know that beautiful young brain of yours can do it. Why are we not learning the algebra, right? Like, where is the homework? Like, where were you at lunchtime when you said that you would come and work with me? And I think as a scientist, to me, and as a mom, right, and as a former teenager myself, right, like, I think one thing that's very different today compared to the way, I grew up, and then even my parents, and going back, like, is that there is like more scientific knowledge about how human nature works. And I hope we get to talk about Madefor, because, as you know, I'm like very interested in, like, if we can use more than willpower and intuition to like make for a happy, productive life ourselves and teach our kids things, like, there's research on growth mindset, there's research on confidence, there's research on when somebody feels anxious, like why it is that they feel anxious, like where that comes from and what we could do about it. Why can't we like take that science on human nature and use that to make teachers and parents like psychologically wiser? I think if I had that as a classroom teacher, instead of just like nagging my students and like exhorting them and bribing them to do their homework and to study, if I knew why it is that sometimes kids don't study, is it confidence? Is it lack of intrinsic motivation? Is it that they're in the desirable difficulty gap? Like, what is it about learning that requires confusion? What is the emotion of confusion? Why is emotion the most common? Why is confusion the most common emotion felt during the learning process? Like, all of these things would have made me a better teacher, and I think would have made me a better parent when I was starting out 20 years ago. So that's the vision of Character Lab, to put a psychologically wise adult in the life of every child, and to do that by connecting the world's leading researchers. Like Danny Kahneman wrote our judgment playbook, like, he's pretty good. Like, like, how do we connect, the Carol Dwecks and the Danny Kahnemans in the world with people? So we facilitate research, and we probably mostly actually do that. Like, we enable people like Harvard Business School to do work on teenagers, like they wouldn't have done that otherwise, but we're like, hey, we have a platform, we'll make it easy. Don't you want to make a difference? And we also share those insights. And we are at a crossroads, because our amazing leader, who's been our leader for over half decade, is transitioning out. And I at one point said like, well, just shut it down because like we're never going to get anybody that good. And I also have a job. So I'm not really the leader of Character Lab. In fact, I'm going to change my title to make it more accurate because I'm a professor and a researcher and a writer. But we are desperately looking, or I should say something more positive, like we are energetically looking, but we are looking.
It's going to be my new top level goal. One of my new
Yes,
top level
please.
goes is to help you find a CEO. So we'll
Thank
figure
you.
this out.
That would be great.
It's so fascinating to hear you talk about Character Lab, and I think much of it very much aligns with what we've been trying to do with Madefor, which is to help people understand the principles that are at play, whether they're physiological or psychological, or what's happening with the brain and the body, and almost the laws of gravity per se that you can't escape. But giving people the knowledge around these laws or these principles in the science, but then also giving them the opportunity and helping them understand that there is not one way. There's not one way to think. There's not one morning routine. There's not one way to hydrate. There's not one way for any of this stuff. And so part of the process is, can you cultivate a mindset of discovery, of growth, and recognition that if I can do this and start to experience within the bounds of these principles, I can navigate to a place where I become my own best guide. And in that process, I have greater agency, I have greater control, I have greater certainty and confidence. And at the same time, I find how to be my own best teammate, to extend myself self-compassion and grace when things go off track, or I disengage, or maybe I fall short, because I don't care if you're a SEAL or a professional athlete or a professor, at some point we all fall short, and how you respond makes all the difference. So can you get good about building a solid foundation that's in line with the principles, but that ultimately gives you a toolkit where you're empowered to move through life in a way that is best for you, and recognize that goal, that top level goal for you, is going to be unique to you. You're an individual. You have unique genetics. You have unique stressors and challenges and opportunities and values and all of these things. And so part of this process is one of self-discovery of what is that thing that drives me and that I can move towards. And so that's what we work on with Madefor. Obviously, we do it with very simple practices, starting with something as simple as helping someone craft an intention and think about, where do I want to be in 10 months time? And why, if I make that change about the way that I'm showing up, why is that not only interesting and exciting to me? Why is that not only going to intrinsically motivate me, but if I achieve it, what's the effect that happens? Why does that make a difference for me? Why does it make a difference for those that I care about in my life? And then we get people into action around these small steps over time, starting with hydration, and that you start to see what happens when someone pays attention to a small thing that they do every day and create awareness of how that affects them. And then you start to see the adjacent impacts of that. So I feel like we're kindred spirits in this.
Why is Madefor called Madefor?
Yeah, for a couple of different reasons. So I love that you're asking. We never get these types of questions. So the idea is that our bodies are made for certain practices, right? There are certain things that everyone requires: social connection. We require exposure to nature. We require water and food and sunlight. And there are things that our bodies are made for. But when we start to become aware of not only what we're made for, but by getting into action around these practices, we all discover that there is potential inside us, that we're made for something more. And it's not just about how we fit, how we meet our individual goals, but how do we assign that top level goal in such a way that we do recognize and internalize that a better world begins with the best me. And so recognizing that this effort that I'm taking on these small goals level up to something bigger, and realize that we're all made for something more. And it's interesting. I went to the Naval Academy for undergraduate. Every month we'd have a new 4-stall lecture taught by some politician or world leader or some bright mind. And I'll never forget. In fact, it's the only thing I remember from any of our lectures. We had a gentleman named Dr. Bernard Harris, who was the first African American astronaut to do a spacewalk. And Dr. Harris gave this amazing talk. But the one thing that I remember him saying is, the word that I hate more than anything else in the English language is when someone tells me I have potential. Because if someone tells me I have potential, it means that I'm not doing everything what I've been doing. And to me, it was like, wow, I love this. This is awesome. And so you see it in the SEAL teams of people unlocking hidden potential. And my training class started with 220. We graduated 17 out of the original. Those 17 people, completely unremarkable. You wouldn't have been able to pick them out from a lineup. And in fact, all the biggest, fastest, strongest people were some of the first to quit and go away. And so what were the characteristics that allowed those 17 people to push their brains and their bodies to a place they didn't think possible, and then to keep going? And I would say that it's not necessarily having individual goals or these meta goals that are to bigger missions that serve humanity, but it's this recognition that you can toggle between both at any point in time to allow you to continue to go. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but
You did
I start
answer my
riffing on
question.
Madefor, I keep going.
I thought that like Madefor, I had a different impression. So I have like this, like superficial understanding of Madefor, and I ordered the books and I got the order, and I was like, so I thought it was made for, because like you were trying to create like physical things like a water bottle or a, journal or whatever, like that would like enable people to develop these psychological assets. So like I thought it was made for, because like it was like actual stuff. But that's wrong, right? Like I'm wrong.
That is wrong. We use these areas of focus, and we use tools to help make it easy for people to get into action, but it's through these small, consistent,
so like
positive pursuits.
Are there classes? Are there like, what are your services and products to advance this?
Yeah, so every month we focus on, it's a year-long program. So every month focuses on one foundational habit, again, like hydration or gratitude or movement or nature or social connection. We give people the science, enough science and story to get someone excited about why they should get into action around that and what the benefits are of a given practice. And then we pair that with a challenge designed around what's the smallest thing we could get you to do over this month, where you're just focused on one thing, so that you see a benefit and you start to navigate to what's right look like for you. So our month on gratitude has a few different components to it. Our hydration month, like, simple tracking how much water you're drinking and how you're feeling the effects of this. And some of this goes back to, what Andrew Huberman researches in the idea of neuroplasticity, and that past the age of 25, there are really two models for brain change, at least self-directed adaptive plasticity. One is, short, intense experiences, positive or negative. These are the peak or the trough experiences. The other is small, consistent actions done over time with awareness of cause and effect. And if you can create that and reinforce those positive actions and the positive effects, then you start to not only build better habits, but you build a better mindset and ultimately unlock a better life. And that's what our program is all about. And so we do base camps like this. We do video calls. We have a whole community online where people can connect with one another and get supported and engaged. But I'm sure we have some members on and listening. They're probably like, oh, we've heard this before, but I never get tired of talking about it.
Sorry about that, members. No. I was asking. It was my fault. But right, so it's primarily sort of educational / it's a structure, right? Like there's something I just want to say as a behavioral scientist who's been trying to work toward voluntary human behavior change for 2 decades that really I just vibe with so much, which is that one of my students, so I teach this class at Wharton called Leading with Grit, and I teach an undergraduate version called Grit Lab, and then I teach actually a high school version called Grit Lab 101. And it is putting the science of grit, of passion and perseverance into practice in your own life. So I'm their guide, I'm their teacher, and we have a class on interest, and they learn about the science of interest. And they hear stories, as you say, of people who have lived their life around their interest. And then there's a challenge, right? Because like you have to experience something for it, I think, to have any chance of really influencing you, because we could all go to a class on interest, read about it, learn about the science, hear some stories, and then do nothing, right? But I think when then you go out and you try to experience the flow state, or you have some structured way of like inventorying your interests and so forth, like that's different. But one thing I want to just say in addition to this is on the last day of class, one of my students asked me this semester, so Dr. Duckworth, like, after class ends, which is like now, like, how will I ever sustain any of these changes? And I thought to myself, that is such a good question. And I'll tell you what I told this student, which is that, everything I've told you in this class is on YouTube, like all of it. It's all Googleable, like, there are books on this, but what I gave you was a structure. And I don't think human beings are very good at doing all the things that we need to do to make us happy, healthy, and productive and helpful without a structure, like it's just the way we are. So you had the structure of Grit Lab. Now you need to find another structure. So one thing I just want to say that I really vibe with is that my guess is that everything that you're telling people is somewhere for free on the internet. But in addition to just being there, like every other human being, I certainly need like a structure to discipline myself, to remind myself, to, sometimes get myself to do things that are in my long-term best interest. But, because other than breathing, there are very few things that we do like spontaneously, as we need, as consistently as we need to live as well as we need to.
Yeah, it's such a great point. I think structure, and I think there's no shortage of information out there, and so you can access anything you want at any time. But I have found that rarely is more information the thing that prohibits progress. The thing that prohibits progress is actually the doing, and so that's the way that we've designed this, is to make it easy and not effortless. They're simple, but they're hard in that simple, not easy. It's this idea that, can we focus your attention on one thing at a time? So I'm drinking water and I'm paying attention to how much water am I drinking, and what does right look like for me, because there's no one size fits all approach to that. But in doing that, you start to realize like, oh wow, when I drink more water, when I drink this amount of water, I feel better. And I know that at a very low deficit, it actually has physical and cognitive impairments to my performance. And you start to, it's not something I've read, it's something I've felt in my body, and I've seen how it's affected me. But the other half of that is, wow, what happens when I'm paying attention to a thing like hydration, something small that I'm doing every day, and starting to understand how it affects me? Well, now I'm realizing that there are other things that I can focus my attention on. How am I sitting when I'm at my desk all day? How stagnant am I? What am I present when I'm eating? How am I present with my kids when I come home from work? You notice all of these adjacent things. And so, but by giving people one simple thing to focus on and really meeting them where they're at and making it doable and accessible, and also getting them excited, because frankly, it's not easy to get someone to drink water, but when you do it and they feel the effects of it, I think the effects can be really lasting. And what we hear from our members is that they get to the end of the program, and it's not that everything is fixed forever and like it's the only the best life going forward, but rather that they have a different lens that they view challenge through, that they view their brains and their bodies through, that and they know that when they get knocked off course, there are things that were within their control that they can lean in on and get into action around, that help buffer them and help them feel better. And so that's that's it. There's no, and there's no permanent fix. There's no like magic pill. You gotta do the work, but we try to make it easy and accessible and ultimately effective for folks. So I know we only have a couple minutes left, and I'm just so grateful for you asking questions about Madefor. Thank you for that. But I know that you're on sabbatical right now. You're working on a new book. Is there any teaser you can give us, or anything you can share about where you're headed next?
Yeah, in our last 60 to 90 seconds, I'll say that I am trying to write a book about what the objective circumstances are that lead people to develop these psychological assets, like a growth mindset, or the skill of creating a new habit, or the ability to make a meaningful connection with another person. Like, what are the objective circumstances? What are the you mentioned nature, like where do we need to be, like physically, or who are the people we need to be around in order for us to be our best selves? So in a way, I'm kind of swimming upstream, because I spent my life understanding the skill sets and mindsets that lead to success and happiness, but now I want to know what leads to that. And so I don't have a title for the book yet, and I haven't really made much headway because my sabbatical just started. But I am very interested in those like foundational questions.
Amazing. Okay, so CEO for the Character Lab and a title for your book.
Please.
These are our new top level goals.
Yes, please.
We'll work on this. Okay, if you could leave people with one takeaway, what's your top line message for folks?
I think that to me, where all growth comes from is some level of awareness, like, understanding. So I'm happy to have had an hour-long conversation where maybe in, some small way, there was an increase in awareness and understanding. I think we're in the middle of a revolution, and we're maybe at the beginning of a revolution, because our ability to understand ourselves, to understand ourselves as human beings, as unique individuals, but also as members of this great species, is like unprecedented. And I think that is, to me, the thing that gives me the greatest optimism for the future.
It's amazing. What a great message. It's something that a similar sentiment we've shared inside Madefor. It's this idea that if you pay attention, that over time you can start to understand how to be your own best guide, and through that process, at some point you can become your own best teammate. And if you can be your own best teammate, then you can be a better teammate for those around you as well. So the individual and the collective, everyone gets raised up. Angela, thank you so much for making time today, for being here. Just so grateful. Thank you for letting me audit your class 10 years ago, because otherwise we wouldn't be here today. So we wish you all the best, and we look forward to checking out the new book, and we'll make sure to keep working on the CEO hunt.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. I hope it's not our last conversation.
Amazing. All right, everyone, take care. We'll talk soon. Cheers.
Bye.